Welcome back, everyone. Once again, I'm Jason Stein, publisher of Automotive News. Great to be with you. Our third session today is titled Movement of Goods Driving the Future of Autonomous Vehicles, and it's brought to you in association with our partners at Ricardo. While automakers' appetite for autonomous passenger cars might be on the decline, there's an attractive business case to bring autonomous commercial vehicles, including trucks and products, to market. In fact, last year saw its fair share of commercial AV announcements from both incumbents and some significant emerging players. Everyone, it seems, wants to be in the $6 billion global transportation business. What are the advantages to automated transport? How's it going to work? How will all these players mesh together? And what will it take to make it a reality, with autonomous movement of goods also building trust with consumers who are out there? We have a great panel coming up, but I want to kick things off with John Kravchuk, CEO of Waymo, which, of course, is an autonomous driving technology company with a very clear mission: make it safe and easy for people and things to get where they're going. He's had some big news recently. Welcome, John.
Hey, thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's great to be here. Wonderful to be a part of your broadcast today.
Thanks so much. Let's start off by talking about your priorities. As we kick off 2021, John, where are you focused? Where is Waymo really looking to make its mark in this year?
So one thing to keep in mind is our product is an interesting product. I like to say that we're not a self-driving car company. We're not a self-driving truck company. Really, our product is the driver. And the Waymo driver seeks to drive all sorts of things. Cars, as we've seen in the application of our Waymo One service, where we're operating now in Phoenix, but also trucks. We love to deliver goods for businesses and shippers. We call that Waymo Via. And we have a couple of different platforms that we're working with right now. One of them is the Chrysler Pacifica, where we're moving goods in Phoenix for partners like UPS. But we've also announced just late last year, partnership with Daimler Trucks and the wonderful Freightliner brand to drive Class 8 trucks on the highways of the Southwest US to get us started.
Specifically on the commercial side, first, John, what are you learning the most? What have you learned the most about those types of applications?
Well, the universal application of the Waymo driver is the goal. One of the things that we're finding, which really wasn't a surprise, we imagined this, is that given the different form factors, the great difference in size between a Class 8 truck, for example, and a Pacifica minivan, we do need to make some modifications to our software. We're using essentially the same sensing suite, what we call the 5th generation Waymo driver that you can see now in the Jaguar I-Paces, which we're just bringing up for the Waymo One service. We're using those same exact sensors, but of course in different locations for the Daimler trucks as we apply this technology to automated trucking.
You mentioned Phoenix earlier, and you hit a pretty significant milestone for the industry last year. Tell me about your fully autonomous experience for your riders in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jason. It's something that we're particularly proud of. So we have been driving in fully autonomous mode for some time, and taking your folks viewing this back a few years, back in 2015, in October 2015, we took the world's first fully autonomous ride on public roads with no safety net. We put a friend of the project, Steve Mann, in our little koala car, what we called internally the Firefly car, and drove it around the streets of Phoenix. And then over the course of these next 5 years, we've been very, very hard at work scaling that to the point now where in October of last year, we felt comfortable enough to let any member of the general public with a cell phone who is able to download the Waymo app from the App Store, either the iOS side or the Google side. They could do that and hail a fully autonomous Waymo car. We've been doing that since October 8th. And so far, the feedback has been terrific. My favorite bit of feedback, Jason, is our riders are happier with the fully autonomous Waymo driver than they had been during the period when we had test drivers in the car. They really seem to prefer some of those advantages that you might imagine of having the space completely to yourself and then being moved around in that fashion. So far,
John,
it's been a great experience.
Sure. You sent out an interesting blog last week, and it was all around the term or the terminology self-driving and leaning into autonomy and fully autonomous driving technology. Maybe you
Yes.
can tell us a little bit more about why you're only going to use the word autonomous from here on out and why that terminology is so important.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for bringing this up because it's top of mind for us. I mean, it turns out language really does matter, and precision in language as we're talking about new technologies is especially important. We made the point that sometimes when a new technology comes out, the first name isn't the name that sticks. For example, the flying machines of 1903, right, eventually became airplanes. And I think we might have gotten the terminology here, self-driving car, somewhat incorrect or imprecise. We come at it from a couple of different perspectives. One of them is a rather selfish one, to be honest, and that is self-driving just doesn't work for us because what is the self in this case? This is an existential question. It's an actual question with some merit. Is the self the car? If so, it doesn't really do good service to the product that we're working on. Our sole product at Waymo is a driver. When we say self-driving, it sort of takes Waymo out of the equation. So that's the first and sort of selfish reason is the cars aren't self-driving, but rather Waymo is definitively driving those cars or those trucks. So that's point one. Point two is that we have seen at times this term being applied to technology that is really better described as driver assist technology. And when automakers describe the technology in legal terms for their users, they're always very good at explaining that this is in fact driver assist technology and you, human driver, are fully responsible for the control of the automobile, right? I think that's an important distinction to make. And we really need to work hard as a collective industry, both on the driver side of the industry, as well as the automotive and trucking side of the industry, to be sure we're using the right terms. Driver assist technology requires a licensed human driver in the car. Fully autonomous technology does not require a licensed human driver in the car or the truck. Waymo is specifically on the right side of that equation, meaning our focus is simply to deploy a fully autonomous Waymo driver and not to work on the driver assist side of that equation. There are a lot of good car companies and others working there, but our product is definitively a driver and a replacement for a human driver. I hope that's clear. We were sort of surprised by the amount of discussion around the terminology and our decision to move away, but we're doing this simply in the interest of clarity, but also honestly out of respect for the product that we're making, the Waymo driver. It's not a self-driver, it's Waymo driving.
Defining the term self to a new level, this like Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche, id, ego, superego, self.
I think there's probably something to that, Jason. Yeah, that's true.
Let's talk about your OEM partnerships. You had some pretty big ones that you announced last year. Volvo Car Group, Daimler Trucks, that's your first truck OEM partnership, and even an expansion with FCA. So what's the strategy behind this, John?
Yeah, so terrific. Let's talk about each of them in turn because they're all really important to us, and I think ultimately to the industry and the people and the businesses that we seek to serve. So first, FCA, an amazing partner for us. They've been with us since 2016. And we started that association when Sergio Marchionne was still running the company. And I've still have very, very fond memories of Sergio and his ideas of what we could do together. That's been sort of continuously reinforced by Mike Manley at FCA and now by Carlos Tavares as part of the Stellantis group, right? We're serving that group now. And what we did with the extension of our relationship was to put more focus, in fact, on the topic that you're focused on here, Jason, which is goods movement. So we're going to be relying increasingly on Stellantis products for our goods movement part of our business at Waymo. So that's a really important point. We're really excited about the Volvo Car Group partnership as well. And what we talked a little bit about when we got started with that announcement was that this would be one of the first cars we were working with from the very start, with an eye for autonomous ride-sharing service. So the vehicle that we're working on together with Volvo Car Group is being designed with this application in mind specifically. And that's going to be something that I think is really useful, both for deploying the Waymo driver, but also for the comfort and convenience of the folks and potentially the goods that will be moving around in that vehicle. Our final OEM announcement this year was with Daimler Trucks. And there we're really excited. We're just getting started with them now, working with their wonderful Freightliner vehicle line to install our 5th generation Waymo driver and get fully autonomous trucking on the roads, starting in the US and the Southwest US.
Excellent. John, I wouldn't be doing this conversation justice if we didn't talk about the number one topic of 2020, which is COVID. You paused your driving operations in March. You resumed carefully over the course of last year, and that really culminated in the relaunch of your Waymo One ride-hailing service in 100% autonomous mode for your riders. But tell me how COVID has changed your operations.
COVID had a significant impact on us this year, Jason. There's no sugarcoating that. We are building a product. The Waymo driver has software applications, and we could keep moving with the software side of our development. But there's a significant hardware development task associated with the Waymo driver. As you know, we're developing our own sensing suite. The LiDAR is Waymo's own LiDAR design. We design it, we make it. The same for the radar and the vision units. We've got 29 cameras now on the 5th generation of the Waymo driver. All of those hardware components were significantly impacted by some of the restrictions and the care that we took to ensure the safety of our workforce and our extended workforce at Waymo. So we definitely experienced delays associated with that has slowed both our mileage accumulation, which is an important part of our testing, but also simply putting the vehicles together, both the cars and the trucks were delayed somewhat. We're back on track now. I'm really happy about that. One of the interesting things, though, that COVID forced us to do more quickly than perhaps we would have was the move to a 100% fully autonomous ride-sharing service in Phoenix. Our initial plan at the start of the year had been to continue a mixture of fully autonomous rides with test drivers. COVID pushed us to what I think was the right decision, which was to come back and be a 100% fully autonomous service in Phoenix.
Okay, finally, John, you recently shared your safety framework and relevant public road data. Tell me the significance of that for the industry.
Jason, thank you for that question. I think it's really important to understand the significance of what we've done, because it sort of flipped the industry orthodoxy on its head. And here I don't blame the industry for the things that have been done before. It's challenging to understand, how do you build trust in your system? And I think the prior art here had been, you build trust by showing demos, show videos of your driver doing a good job handling challenging situations. But the reality is, demo videos are carefully curated, and I don't care how long they are. There is editing that goes on, and there are things that we would just naturally do, any company in this space, to make your technology seem really good and really competent. Like, it's okay. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. The problem is, you're not showing your weaknesses. You're not showing the flaws. You're not showing the mistakes that your driver made. And that's what we did at the end of October with the release of our safety reports. We shared every bad aspect of our driving, over 10 million kilometers of driving, and no one's ever done that before. We literally showed every bit of contact with the physical world, and we had 47 of those in total, including those that we reconstructed in situations where we had safety drivers in the car. And we shared every single one of those bad outcomes, and we gave detail about every single one of those bad outcomes. And we shared all those bad outcomes, not just with the world, but also with really intelligent third parties who could look at that, assess it, and say, wow, that's pretty impressive. That's what I think is important and really different about what we've done with the release of our safety framework at the end of
Well,
October.
when I was with you in 2019, John, there were no bad incidents and no bad outcomes with your Waymo vehicle. So appreciated that again, and we look forward to even more positive news for the future. John Kravchuk, thank you so much for joining me here at our CES Shift program.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jason. We're glad to be here on behalf of everyone at Waymo. Take care. All the
Thank
best
you,
to you in
John.
2021.
Same to you. Now to lead us into the panel, here's my colleague again, Steve Smith.
Thanks, Jason. We've got a terrific panel discussion to dive a little bit deeper into the future movement of goods. I'd like to introduce Daniel Laurie, CEO of UDELV, Sharif Marakbi, Vice President of Research and Development for Magna International, and Marques McCammon, President of RicardoNorthAmerica. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. We've got an exciting conversation planned for us. Why don't we start in? Sharif, I'd like to ask all of you this question, but maybe Sharif, will start with you. What are the trends when it comes to the future movement of goods that our listeners and our audience really need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity, Steve. This last year has not been a normal year for most of us, so we've seen the trends change a bit in a good way in the case of moving goods, because we do see the e-commerce and things delivered to the home accelerate, and the opportunity really presents itself nicely in an autonomy standpoint. The other trend that we're seeing is the continued acceleration and growth in the trucking industry, which is an opportunity for autonomy as well when we think about transportation that is less pedestrian prone on highways exit to exit. So we do see in general nice acceleration for moving goods in the last year, and that will continue into the future.
Daniel, how about your point of view?
Well, being on the panel as a fully dedicated company dedicated to delivery, the first point I would like to make is that the movement of goods will be, I think, the first large application of autonomous vehicles. It is safer and easier to carry goods than people, and the public will probably familiarize itself with the technology without having to step into the vehicle, and regulators and insurers alike will get a chance to observe how autonomous vehicles work with a lower risk exposure. The second trend is a massive shortage of drivers, leading to inflationary pressures on labor expenses. Driver costs already represent about 65% of total last and middle mile delivery costs on average, and are continuously on the rise. So truck driver shortage is projected to triple within the decade, and delivery costs will continue to rise because of that. The third trend is contactless delivery. Removing the risk of contamination between drivers and consumer has been a major trend of the 2020 year, and probably will continue to be in 2021. The fourth trend is environmental and safety related. Transportation is responsible for 28% of greenhouse gas emissions, and light trucks are the second cause of traffic accidents, fatalities on the road. So the double revolution of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles will make our roads safer and cleaner. And finally, last but not least, the last trend is convenience and improving people's lives. Computers will manage machine availability, on-time performance, delivery locations, returning goods, and several other aspects that will considerably improve people's lives.
Marques, what is Ricardo watching? And in some cases, what are you advising your clients on the trends that they should be looking out for on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. So I'd say we're watching, like the other panelists have outlined. I mean, you see trends where an autonomy in the movement of goods is a factor, and it's going to be multifaceted. So generally, when we talk about movement of goods, we're thinking about it being wholly terrestrial, but there is also an advancing conversation about how do we make some portion of that activity airborne. So the aerospace industry is leaning in fairly aggressively, whether it be with unmanned aircraft, drones, or manned short distance flight aircraft. But inside of the terrestrial vehicle space, We're looking at how data is going to augment the delivery and the overall operational threshold of the vehicle. So having better understanding of the vehicle throughout its functional operating environment, providing data to the end item consumer or to the fleet manager as the vehicle is being used. So that's going to be a significant trend. And then again, the electrification, providing lower carbon opportunities for the goods to be moved. I mean, we saw the movement earlier or later in 2020 from the state of California making a statement that they were not going to allow diesel trucks into the state after 2027. These kinds of trends are going to continue to drive innovation in electrification, hybridization, use of fuel cell. These are the places where we are engaging with our customers pretty heavily.
So all of you, not surprisingly, touched on a couple of key themes, and largely those are around autonomy. They were around electrified, they were around connected, and we saw in 2020 a lot of vehicle announcements that incorporated all of those technologies. But I think more interesting, and I think germane to this conversation, is the fact that a lot of those were destined for deployment in last mile and middle mile delivery. Seems to me that perhaps some of these OEMs, some of these manufacturers are shifting some of that near-term focus away from the connected, autonomous, electrified movement of people to the electrified and autonomous movement of goods. So again, I'd like perspectives from everybody. Marcus, we'll stay with you. Why is that? Why are we seeing that maybe shift in focus?
Yeah, well, the quick answer is the complexity of the operating environment when you talk about the movement of people, right? So when we talk about the movement of goods, the routes that we want to move, the materials that we're moving are less restrictive, and they're more predictable. So what do I mean by less restrictive? Consumers, we as individual people are the epitome of an edge case, right? So when there's an opportunity for a human to do something out of the ordinary, we find a way to do that. In the movement of goods, in the trucking space, whether you're trucking, rail, what have you, it's repeatability that drives to efficiency and makes a better business model. That repeatability removes some of the risk from the operating environments that we consider when we look at things like autonomy and platooning, so on and so forth. So if I can isolate the operating environment and the requirements on the vehicle, then I can reduce the risk of the deployment of the technology, and it helps us to get it to the market faster.
Sherry, from a supplier and a manufacturer perspective, I'm sure there's implications not only from a scaling perspective, but also from a safety perspective, right? You maybe don't have to have as many requirements for the safe movement of goods as you do for humans. Can you talk a little bit about some of those changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think consistent with what Marcus was talking about, it's a less complex environment, but it's also less complex technology, and it's more ready for deployment sooner. So examples of that are when we have the speed, how fast can the vehicle of whatever shape and form it is can move. The sensing technology that we're developing and the whole industry is developing around, whether it's radars or LiDARs or ultrasonics or cameras, lives with a simpler environment when you're talking about moving goods. And I wanted to make sure that we don't lose track that the fact is the whole industry is continuing to develop the complex solutions for moving people. It just takes probably, there's been a lot of realization in the last couple of years that it's just very, very hard, especially as you mentioned, from a functional safety standpoint and making sure that you can deploy the technology that's 100% operational the way you want it to operate. So the environment is simpler, the perception and what you see using the sensor technology and the software is simpler, and also the compute and the processing of the data and telling the vehicle to do certain things is also simpler. You combine that with the fact that the hesitation by the consumer, in some cases, it's not 100%. So there are folks out there that are still concerned about the technology from a safety and getting in for moving people, makes moving goods the first application of this technology. And from a producer and engineering of the sensor and the suite of autonomy, it makes sense that this would be, from a timeline, more conducive to launch first before we launch the moving goods solutions. And then when you look at the trucking industry, the large trucking industry, call it Class 8 trucking industry, it's mostly driven on highways where there are no pedestrians. So that's another simplification of the technology. So the technology really lends itself nicely to initially the launch of the moving goods.
Daniel, I'd like your perspective on that as well. And I'd also ask you a follow-up. As an operator of a lot of these vehicles and having your vehicles already out on the road, I'd like your point of view on how these technologies in the commercial space are working. But to Sherif's point as well, I'd like to start with, I'd like to then hear your point of view on how is this going to translate into consumer trust, consumer accepting these, people actually getting into these type of vehicles as the future of movement of people continues to be autonomous, electrified, and connected?
Well, if you look back at the history of transportation over the past 300 years, every new mode of transportation started with cargo first. The first automobile, actually, very few people know about that, but the first automobile was in fact created in 1769 in France. It was a steam engine to carry pieces of artillery for the French armies. And it took more than 100 years before automobiles were designed to carry people. It's the same for trains, planes, rockets, hyperloops, you name it. It is safer to carry goods than it is to carry people. And you can also generally start in less dense operating domains because malls and shopping centers and B2B operations are mostly located in suburban areas, whereas robotaxis need to operate in denser environments that are much more complicated from an autonomous vehicle standpoint. With that said, I would like to emphasize the fact that there's a different type of challenge with carrying goods, which is how to engineer a vehicle without a driver that can automate a delivery journey across multiple types of industries with multiple types of goods. And this is a hardcore engineering problem that the industry has not addressed yet, but UDELV has spent its early life trying to solve that problem. And for a solution to be financially viable, it has to be mass produced, which means being capable of moving more or less 80% of the goods that you need to carry at a cost that is less, if not significantly less than a manned service. So this is, I think, the challenge beyond the autonomous driver itself. This is the challenge of creating an automated delivery system.
And Eric, I'm sorry, Steve, if I could pitch in on that as well. So one of the things that we also need to consider is that's a benefit for us moving the focus of autonomy towards the movement of goods is packaging and space and cost.
Yes.
Okay, so when we start looking about how we would integrate this technology into passenger cars, the cost pressures and the packaging pressures on a passenger car are enormous, right? So you have, we try to optimize the spacing inside of the vehicle for people in cargo. And the level of compute that you need for some of these systems. I mean, in most of the autonomous vehicle demonstrators or research vehicles that are on the road today, we effectively have supercomputers riding in the trunks of the cars, right? So and it's going to take us some time to get those to a package that not only fits within the confines of the vehicle, but also fits within the cost structure of the vehicle. When you move to a commercial trucking application, those constraints are lessened. They don't go away, but they're significantly less. And the notion that there's a level of customization in the package and configuration of a truck is part and parcel to that industry. So that gives us a level of design freedom where, because effectively we're not walking away from the pursuit, as Sherif said, we're not walking away from the pursuit of autonomy in passenger cars. But what we are doing is taking advantage of the fact that there is a different set of variables in the movement of goods that will allow us to gather data and better understand the operating environment such that we can have our movement in passenger car be more robust as it comes forward.
Well, I think there's also, and to go back to your earlier conversation, I'd like your point of view, the panel's point of view on this as well. Certainly complexities around passengers are different than complexities around movement of goods. But I think, Marcus, you brought something up early on that says, right, there's this added complexity when you're talking about a last mile delivery vehicle also equipped with flying drones, right? There's an entirely different set of complexities, I think, that need to be addressed. And I'd appreciate your point of view on that.
Yeah, so when we start looking at the holistic view of mobility, right, in the movement of goods. So one of the things at Ricardo, we try to look at transport in a holistic view. We have a division that focuses on rail. We look at automotive and industrial, which is inclusive of aerospace. We look at marine as well. So what we imagine is that we have the ability in this new environment to see for middle mile, imagine a truck driving along freeways in Arizona that are very low populated. It's very easy for sensors to perceive the environment. They'll be able to do so much better than a human can. But before we enter into an urban area, say, before you get to Phoenix, right, you have the ability to deploy drones either from that vehicle or from a close proximity to the vehicle that could carry cargo closer to the endpoint of delivery. And then from there, you could either have human interaction, which would ultimately, imagine how much we have gotten, to Daniel's point, there is an absence or a lessening number of available drivers. So now we can put the focus of the drivers on that last mile and have everything that leads them up to that point happening autonomously or semi-autonomously. Or we can, in some instances, obviously everyone knows about Amazon's pursuits. You can have a scenario where the drone brings it almost to the doorsteps of the customer, and you continue on with the trend of touchless delivery.
Yeah, I would just add that I know I agree with the comments. There's a targeted application for goods delivery that has to be thought through as someone is what are you delivering and what's the consumer acceptance of that? Today, we're all used to certain things being delivered to our door without it, just open the door and find it. Or in some cases, you have to go out to, especially with autonomy, with certain commodities, you have to go out to the curb to get it, or maybe you're not at home when that gets delivered, and that presents another challenge. So we think that thinking through what are you delivering autonomously, we want the convenience. It isn't autonomy for the sake of autonomy.
Exactly.
And there may be a hybrid solution for certain deliveries, even including humans in some cases at the end, where we have to really think about, and it isn't just delivering anything and everything to anywhere. That is not going to be the first application. We really have to think about that.
Yeah, Sharif, I would add on to that, and quite honestly, it brings up an interesting complexity. We're talking about the machines, we're talking about, right, the capabilities, the safety of the machines, but there is this underlying process, particularly when it comes to movement of goods, that talks about route optimization and the data and uptime and all of that stuff that makes, right, the seconds matter in the movement of goods. And I sit here in my home office and I watch Amazon vans come down my road multiple times a day, and it's always curious to me, outside of the machines, the technology is driving that. It's always curious to me. So why can't Amazon just make one trip down my road, right? And that sort of optimization of the movement of goods for efficiency outside of the technology. So, the question for you, why is that not happening in terms of route optimization and specific vehicles making one trip into a neighborhood versus multiple trips into a neighborhood?
Yeah, I'd like to share one thing. It also depends on where you are in the world, because the acceptance by the consumer of things being delivered could be very different. I mean, a good example of that is batching. Why not deliver a big batch or several batches at the same time and make one trip, and it's more optimized to roughly the same area? And the real answer to that is it would be ideal from an optimization standpoint. The consumer acceptance and the speed, because remember, there's the optimization, but also the speed of delivery and when things are expected to be delivered is something that, of course, Amazon spends a lot of time on, as well as every other company that's doing this. So needless to say, there's definitely a lot of opportunities here for more optimization, and it would be helpful in the moving people as well. But we also have to really think about what's acceptable, because the cost is a big piece of it, but there's a lot of other factors from a consumer standpoint that we have to think about, including time of delivery. And even today with human-driven vehicles, why do you see what you're talking about? Why do you see individual deliveries, even of people that are happening? So a sweet spot between optimization and all the other factors are what's going to help us as an industry, and also the technology to really make sure that we have enough volume and enough scale and enough people that want this stuff delivered to that would work. So there's a sweet spot that has not happened yet.
Daniel, from your perspective, how are you and your company approaching optimization, route optimization?
Well, it's interesting. You were mentioning Amazon. I think Amazon taught us a very bad habit, which is that you can order anything from Amazon, from the smallest item, and do it multiple times, and they're going to deliver it to you. So you can order a toothpaste, some toothpaste in the morning, and it's one tube, and then a toothbrush in the evening, and they're going to be delivered to you, each one at a different time, and so it's a very different way of running errands than what people were used to in the past, and that's the reason why you see an Amazon truck going multiple times on the same route. I don't think that Amazon is going to be the first example of autonomous delivery, because the routes are too dense. They're delivering somewhere between 200 and 300 packages per day in a 10-hour shift. And there's no way an autonomous vehicle is going to be able to beat that, at least not in the beginning. So I think that the autonomous delivery industry is going to have to focus on something slightly different. And the industry is so large, by the way, that that's not a problem. But we think that the first application is going to be B2B, point to point, because that's the easiest thing to do. First of all, from a machine learning standpoint, it's the easiest because those are fixed, repeatable routes. And second, if you're talking about B2B, point to point, you're going to have professionals on both sides loading and unloading the vehicle. And the industry is going to learn from that. And then gradually it's going to go towards maybe heavier, denser routes where you don't make 2 or 3 stops, but you make 10, 20 stops in a route, 40 stops when you're talking about a Walmart supercenter, for example, which is probably making, if you're talking about grocery, somewhere around 30 to 45 stops in a 12-hour day. And that's where the industry is going to evolve. And then eventually when that is mastered, then the industry is going to move to much denser routes like the Amazon routes, perhaps by having a way to solve the last 10 to 20 feet. I don't know if it's going to be drones, but perhaps some sort of robot. But that's almost science fiction at this point, and that's going to be the future. I think we're going to start with B2B. I think we're going to start with easier routes, and then gradually improve towards a little bit more complex, like the 40-stop kind of route.
Yeah, well, I think another factor that we need to consider is that there's a socioeconomic implication of everything that we're doing, right? So I think everything that has been articulated is extremely valid, and I'll double down on what Daniel said, is that we will start with relatively simplistic routes from a B2B perspective. Like the point that was made earlier, there's a shortage of drivers, right? So when we do B2B delivery, then we're typically, the large Class 8 trucks are typically routed in directions that they don't go into areas that are heavily populated, right? We intentionally do route planning to try and keep them away from that space, whether it be because of maneuverability, because of the nature of the cargo, whatever the case may be. So that actually, again, makes the operating environment simpler for us to plan. It de-risks the operating environment so that the chances of an edge case that results in collateral damage is minimized. Okay, and truthfully, when we look at the shortage of drivers that we have, we can apply a solution, autonomy, as a solution to that shortage there. And then where we do have drivers and availability, the jobs can be distributed elsewhere into into those community use cases where the edge cases, a dog running across the street, a kid with a ball, we're not ready to let those things be managed autonomy, whether it be us from the industry perspective or the consumer in there seeing it and being comfortable with it, right? And then those things will move over time, because one of the things that, when we look at the data, the part of the resistance that we've seen to consumers adopting autonomy is not only the notion that I don't trust the computer to drive me around, but it's also the fear that the computer's going to take my job away or somehow reduce my livelihood. In truth, us inside of the industry are looking for that technology to do the opposite, to create new opportunities for people to be moved around and goods to be moved around and to make those things safer. But there's still a psychological impact that we are going to have to grow through for autonomy to take hold in mass scale. So I think, doing middle mile delivery, B2B delivery, and then augmenting that with humans in the more dense areas is clearly a near-term strategy. And then again, over time, we'll evolve into more complex scenarios.
Let's turn our attention to environment. Certainly the electrification of vehicles has a lot of environmental benefits, and we're continuing to see those as the car park of electric vehicles continues to grow, particularly in the United States. When we talk about environment, when we talk about electrification and a commercial movement of goods, what are the benefits? What are we looking at here? Maybe not only, certainly on the roads, but I would also include in that airports, transportation hubs, ports. What is the environmental impact when it comes to electrification of commercial vehicles?
I would just probably venture to say that it's massive, because technically you don't necessarily need to combine some of these technologies, but environmentally and the impact on society, it makes a lot of sense to combine electric vehicles with autonomous vehicles and such. And the nice thing about commercial applications that lends itself nicely to the impact of the environment and sustainability is that it's predicted routes, and it's a lot of driving. So as Daniel mentioned earlier, you look at big numbers, and continuous routes between certain locations lend itself nicely to autonomy and electrification. That's going to continue. And the impact on the environment would be more from what we see than personally owned vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at scenarios like the port of Los Angeles, right? Largest port on the West Coast. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of vehicles that move through the port on a daily basis. At any point in time, the majority of those trucks are sitting idle, the majority of their time. So I've seen data that says 50 to 60% of the time they're idling, waiting for their queue to pick up their next bit of cargo. If you could take that idle time and effectively have it switched off because it's an electric vehicle, and then move to acquire those goods under electric power in a very controlled environment, you reduce the opportunity for a risk of, again, collateral damage, whether it's to the goods or to people in the environment. You reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that usually hover over top of ports because you no longer have the internal combustion engines running constantly. And then once you move out of that space and you move them onto the highway, autonomy gives us the opportunity for things like platooning, where just having the vehicles drafting what a passenger would consider tailgating one another at a closer distance at speed can save anywhere between 5 and 15% in terms of fuel economy.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question here. And we've talked a lot of important trends, and we've talked about a lot of different companies that are helping usher in this future movement of goods. It takes a lot of partnership. It takes a lot of collaboration from manufacturers to operators to companies that are building the infrastructure in which these vehicles are going to operate. Sharif, let's start with you. How is Magna approaching these sort of business ecosystem collaborations and partnerships?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Just in general, and it ties a lot to a lot of things we talked about. From a technology standpoint, I wanted to mention that let's not forget driver assistance technology, which are happening today on personal owned vehicles. And much of that technology would actually directly apply to autonomous vehicles. So Magna is developing technology in today's personal ownership world in preparation for full autonomous driving, and that applies to sensing, radars, lidars, ultrasonics, cameras, domain controllers, and processing. And it also applies to vehicles. There's a lot of technology in today's vehicles that we need to take to the next level as it gets into autonomy. So it's really important that we approach a technology, especially when you need it to work 100% of the time from a functional safety standpoint, that it's not there yet in the complex moving people environment. Otherwise, you'd be seeing these things everywhere for robotaxis. But there are steps that were taken from a development of technologies. And then on the partnership side, we're actually pretty excited about even some of the recent announcements we've had with some of the personal owned vehicle manufacturers that are more of a startup or newcomers, as well as looking at some of the electrification technologies like our collaboration and partnership with LG Electronics just to do electric motors and inverters and things that go into electric vehicles. Those are things that really matter.
Daniel, from your perspective as an operator, how's your company approaching these collaborations with other sectors, adjacent sectors to the movement of goods?
Yeah, well, from our perspective and talking to our clients and numerous retailers and shippers in the industry, we must be careful to make sure that the costs of the service and the cost of the equipment does not offset the benefits of removing the driver, especially when in some areas we're competing against crowdsourced delivery service providers. So it's our belief and our work at UDELV that we need to engineer a very, very smart product that can optimize for costs at all manufacturing and operational levels. And the problem is so complex and so costly that we think it's unlikely that one company can solve it alone. The ecosystem is actually shaping up to become partnerships between OEMs, autonomous stack companies acting like tier one suppliers, and service providers like UDELV. Service and technology providers. UDELV has focused most of its resources on solving the delivery management engineering problem, and its architecture to accept any other autonomous stack or work with powertrain and drivetrain providers and OEMs for the assembly and manufacturing of the vehicle itself. We're mostly focused on solving the business issue, and we are and will continue to be partnering with providers in the space. At the same time, we're very, very optimistic about the future of last of and middle mile delivery for both service providers and consumers alike, because we think that it's going to provide benefits in terms of generating a higher lifetime value of revenue for the industry, as well as a much more convenient and much cheaper service for the consumers. So I think it's going to improve everybody's lives at the end of the day.
Marcus, and we'll close with you. How are you advising your clients on how they should be approaching operating in a highly complex and I think converging business ecosystem?
Absolutely. So the reality is, so the collaboration model is part and parcel of what we do, right? I mean, that's kind of Ricardo's business and has been for the whole 105 years we've been in existence. The thing that's happening that's unique now is the industry is changing fundamentally. And the notion that anyone can do it all by themselves is just fallacy. So we do collaborations with everyone from the Department of Energy to universities to OEMs and tier ones, and our customers are having to do the exact same thing, because as the pressures of bringing this new technology to bear, along with the normal competitiveness of the market, continue, and then whatever other geopolitical or economic challenges that may arise, it's going to be more important for each part of the industry, each part of the ecosystem, to really understand what they do well and focus on their knitting, so to speak, and then learn to leverage the components and the solutions that the other parties bring to the table. That way, every member of the ecosystem is not trying to invest to invent the value that the guy next to them did, but they're really focusing on the places where they can be differentiated and drive material value for their end customers. And so that's how we're advising our clients, helping them to understand where the best ideas are coming from, and then learning how to integrate them into their roadmap and their vision, but do so in a way that's robust and productive.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on what I think has been a terrific conversation. Thank you also to Marcus and your team at Ricardo for supporting our program here that we're delivering. Thank you again for joining us. For those in our audience, we're going to take one more quick break. We'll be back in about 10 minutes and wrap up our Shift Mobility Forum with a conversation with what's ahead on the road to mobility. We'll see you in just a few minutes.